Austatud istungi juhataja,
Honorable Speaker,
Riigikogu liikmed,
members of Riigikogu, and all other listeners.
mul on väga hea meel
I am very pleased to have this opportunity
sellest
to talk
olulisest
about
teemast
this
täna
important
siin
subject here today.
ja veel rohkem
And even more,
on mul hea meel
I'm happy to listen to your questions
nendele
and answer them.
informatsiooni Estonia
There is so much information about the Estonia disaster
palju, et
that it is simply not possible to talk about everything at once.
nii. Suures plaanis
In general, there are three views regarding the Estonia ferry disaster.
üks on lojaalne ametlikule
One is loyal to the official version. According to this, the final report of the International Joint Commission of the Cause of the Shipwreck, published in 1997, contains the final and exhaustive truth. The second view is diplomatically skeptical. According to this, the work of this investigation commission was incomplete, and therefore the cause of the shipwreck is still uncertain. In other words, no version can be definitely confirmed or rejected. There is a third view next to the two. According to this, the Estonia did not sink as written in the official final report, while the real cause of the disaster is known, but it has been hidden for 26 years and will continue to be hidden. I share the last view. I really think that Estonia was drowned in an event that the Swedish government circles have decided to hide on the pretext of protecting national security. I don't know what this event is, but it must be related to the activities of the Swedish Defense Forces or the Swedish Special Service. Only the influence of the Defense Forces and the Special Service, including influence over politicians, can, in my view, explain the actions of the Swedish government in the 26 years since the disaster. In my opinion, this activity has been irrational and insensitive. It is impossible to believe that after the disaster, the Swedish state did not use its technical capabilities to investigate the causes of the disaster. 852 people are on the seabed, most of them are Swedes. The Swedish government is doing nothing. Divers and robots are staying ashore and submarines are in port. Can you believe that? I can't. Therefore, I think, in fact, the research ships were sent to the wreck as soon as possible. What did the divers and robots do and see on the seabed? No one talks about that. It is also important to understand all that has been done under the Swedish government's pretext for securing the sanctity of the grave. As early as the end of 1994, the Swedish government decided to cover the shipwreck with concrete. Despite strong opposition from the families of the deceased, this decision, unprecedented in the maritime history, was implemented. Thousands of tons of sand, gravel, and rubble were poured on the shipwreck, preventing access to the bottom side of the ship. In addition, the sanctity of the grave agreement was initiated and signed in February 1995 with Estonia and Finland. The International Commission of Investigation had not yet completed its work, but the investigation into the wreck was made both legally and physically impossible. This is not how investigations are normally conducted. It is also impossible to understand the misunderstandings that accompanied the only known diving operation carried out in December 1994 by private companies. I do not have time today to list all the cases that accompany this operation, but I will be still talking about some. The first concerns films made on the seabed during the operation, which originally consisted of 2 originals. According to the contract, one original remained with the contractor and the other with the client, the Swedish Maritime Administration. The contractor destroyed his original shortly after the work was completed. However, the fate of the original left to the client is unknown. It was either lost or classified. Imagine an investigation of a disaster that kills 852 people. But the most important piece of evidence, a film made at the shipwreck, is lost. It disappears before the members of the Commission of Investigation can watch it. And that wasn't the only evidence that was lost. According to the official version, the shipwreck was caused by the locks of the bow visor breaking and the visor falling into the sea. The largest and strongest of the visor locks was the bottom lock, which was also called the Atlantic lock. It acted like a large latch where the locking bolt was pushed with the help of a jet drive through the ship hull and through the lock fasteners attached to the visor. During the diving research, the Atlantic lock was welded open and brought to the surface so that it could be examined further. However, no further investigation took place, as the only member of the Joint Investigation Commission involved in the diving operation, Björn Stenström, threw the lock back into the sea, thus destroying the most important piece of evidence. Another important misunderstanding relates to the dispute over whether the bottom of the ship hull was observed or filmed at all. This dispute has now arisen over the hole that was found by the Norwegian documentary makers in the middle part of the ship. You might think that you could be able to take the 1994 film of the diving and see if there are any boulders near this hole. Unfortunately, this is not possible because the available ship hull inspection diving film mainly consists of breaks. We find the following entry in the log about the observation of the middle part of the ship. At 1953, the robot descends to the mud border in the middle of the ship. 1 minute later, at depth of 88 meters, is fixated. Another minute later, the recording is interrupted. This recording is resumed at 2022. 27 minutes after the recording was initially interrupted. In short, in the middle of the ship where the filmmakers found the hole, the diving robot was operating for 27 minutes. But we do not know what the robot saw or did there, because apparently the camera of the robot was not recording. To conclude, I would also like to mention what happened to the representative of the Estonian state, Arne Valgma, who participated in the operation. When the divers were instructed, he was not allowed into the room. A policeman stood in front of the door and sent the Estonian back to his cabin. Unbelievable. The sinking of a ship which was sailing under the flag of Estonia is investigated, but when the plans are being made, the Estonian is left behind the door. All in all, there is not really anything to say. Important evidence is not filmed or is simply destroyed. The original films made at the shipwreck disappear without a trace, and the representative of the flag state is left out of the plans for the diving to the shipwreck. If there had been only one or two debacles, or if an everyday traffic accident had been investigated, one would believe that these problems were due to stupidity or negligence. However, as this was the worst modern maritime accident in the Baltic Sea, it unintentionally seems that the diving mission carried out in December 1994 was not intended to establish the truth, but on the contrary, to make it impossible to establish the truth. Subsequent investigations by the Swedish government have taken place in the same spirit. For example, the investigation concerning Soviet military equipment, which was carried on board of the Estonia a week and two prior to the accident. This secret military equipment transportation operation was disclosed by former Swedish customs officer Lennart Henriksson. The investigation by the Swedish government was carried out by one man, Judge Johan Hirschfeldt. He met with the heads of the relevant national authorities, but not with the whistleblower customs officer, nor with the specific intelligence officer who carried out the operation. Nor did Johan Hirschfeldt thoroughly examine the working materials of the International Commission of Investigation or the materials of the criminal investigation carried out in Sweden. Nor did Johan Hirschfeldt contact the company that allegedly owned the car carrying the Soviet military equipment. At the end of the investigation, Judge Hirschfeldt destroyed all the collected evidence. While the testimony of former customs officer Lennart Henriksson was at least investigated, the second whistleblower was simply ignored. In 2000, Håkan Bergmark, a Swedish citizen, told various journalists that he had been involved in a Swedish Defense Forces diving operation at the wreck of the Estonia just a few days after the accident. His task was to study and film the bow of the ship. He discovered a large hole with signs of an explosion at the starboard side of the ship. The hole was elongated, estimated to be about 4 meters high and extended both below and above the waterline. Håkan Bergmark not only spoke about the hole in the hull of the ship, but described the whole diving operation in detail. Among other things, he named the officer who led this operation. In other words, using the terminology of court proceedings, Håkan Bergmark made every effort to verify his allegations. However, this has never been done. No investigation had been initiated to investigate his allegations. Inquiries from journalists were sent to the Swedish Defense Forces. The journalists were given an answer that the Swedish Defense Forces are not obliged to investigate or comment on anything. 15 years ago, I also tried to meet the officer who led this operation, but I was not allowed to do so. So, all of the above would not be significant if the official version of the cause of the ship disaster would be convincing, but the official version is not convincing. The visor version, as set out in the final report, has long been not a subject of debate. For the past 20 years, there has been a if-then style discussion about its various modifications. Some experts consider it more, some less likely, and some completely rule it out. If there is any consensus at all, it is in that there is nothing conclusively definite. Even all investigations initiated and funded by various governments have concluded that though the visor version is the most likely, it is not the only possible cause of the disaster. Next, I will try to explain very briefly what the problem with the so-called visor version is. According to the final report of the Joint Investigation Commission, the cause of the shipwreck is that the locks of the bow visor broke, the visor fell into the sea and pulled the bow ramp open. A large amount of water flooded the car deck from the open bow. The water caused a heel on the starboard side of the ship, and the ship sank after 35 minutes. Several experts have stated that this could not have been the case. When a passenger ship heels greatly, the windows of cabins, cafes and other passenger spaces, as well as external doors, are submerged. Due to waves and water pressure, the windows and doors break. Water enters the ship, and in a matter of minutes, the ship goes around. As the overturning is rapid, air is trapped into the watertight bottom of the ship and prevents the ship from sinking to the bottom. Quick overturning and slow sinking. This is how all passenger ships that have lost their stability have behaved before and after Estonia. Some examples. A ship named Herald of Free Enterprise left the port of Zeebrugge with an open visor. The visor was simply forgotten to be closed. As the ship increased its speed, water reached the car deck and the ship capsized within 90 seconds. Although this took place near a shore, 188 people died. This is simply because people couldn't react in 90 seconds to save themselves from the sinking ship. A similar accident happened in 2015 on the Yangtze River with the passenger ship Eastern Star. The wind tilted the ship, and in less than a minute the ship turned upside down. On the river, where the shores were a stone's throw away, 7 out of 454 people survived. The Senegalese ship Leola, which carried 1,863 people to the seabed, capsized in 5 minutes and sank only 16 hours later. The Estonia did exactly the opposite. The Estonia remained largely upright for about half an hour, and once it capsized, it immediately sank to the bottom. Let's be more specific. If the ramp of the Estonia had been fully opened, it would have taken 2 to 3 minutes for 2,000 tons of water to reach the car deck. In the next 2 to 3 minutes, the ship would have completely overturned. If that had happened, no one would have escaped from the Estonia. But people did escape. About 300 people reached the outside of the ship, 137 of whom were rescued. In short, in theoretical terms, there are 2 major questions that the Joint Investigations Commission's final report does not answer and to which no one else has found any convincing answer. It is unknown why the Estonia did not capsize quickly and how water managed to get under the car deck to sink the ship. All alternative theories revolve in a sense around a hole in the bottom of the ship. And indeed, assuming that there is a hole in the bottom of the ship, the aforementioned problems disappear. The water that would have entered from the hole would have inevitably accumulated on one side of the ship and capsized it, only that the growth of the heel would have been slower and more even in this case. And of course, in the case of the so-called hole theory, the question of how water got into the rooms under the car deck disappears. Even better, this version of the ship sinking, where seawater is floating in the ship from both the entrance to the car deck and from a hole in the ship's hull, fits the known time frame really well. In conclusion, until it is proven that the hull of the Estonia is intact, it is also theoretically not possible to rule out versions that assume that there is a hole in the ship. As difficult as it is for the official version to deal with theoretical objections, it is just as difficult to conform it with the statements of those who escaped this ship. First off, the ramp. As mentioned, according to the official version, the water entered the ship through the fully opened bow ramp. However, no survivor at any point in time has seen the ramp open. Yet there are 5 witnesses who claim the opposite. A mechanic who was on duty in the engine control room has said that shortly after 1 o'clock he felt two strong blows, and after a few moments the ship capsized. He stood up and looked at the monitor and saw that water was squeezing in from the sides of the ramp. Then the motorman and soon also the system mechanic came into the room. The motorman remembers being in the workroom when the ship began to heal. He then went to the engine room and looked at the monitor. He saw it too. The ramp was closed and water was squeezing from its edges. The system mechanic remembers being on the 0 deck in the sewage room, where he heard 3 consecutive thrusts. When the ship capsized, he went into the engine room, looked at the monitor and saw the same thing as the others. The ramp was in in its place and water came in from its edges. When the motorman and the system mechanic left the room, the tilt was 20 to 30 degrees. When the mechanic left, the heel was definitely over 30 degrees. So in about 20 minutes, the heel grew from 0 to 30 degrees. However, all this time, the ramp was closed. Everyone who has tried to prove the wiser version has had problems with these testimonies. One way and another has been tried, but in the end, a simple decision has been made. The surviving sailors are lying, and that's the truth. These three testimonies cannot be matched in any way with the official Bauweiser version. Thus, those who believe in the official version will inevitably also believe that the surviving Estonian sailors are lying. And these are not the only testimonies that interfere with the official theory. The previous speaker talked about how he and his companion climbed down the ramp at a time when the ship was already sideways. This means that there was a tilt of at least 90 degrees. As you heard previously, these testimonies have also been ignored as if they did not exist. On one hand, the Joint Investigation Commission's claim that the ramp was opened is based on the theoretical discussion that since the edge of the visor extended beyond the ramp, it simply had to pull the ramp down when it fell. On the other hand, that the ramp fastenings and hinges were damaged. Both arguments are relevant, but not irrefutable. The visor edge did indeed extend beyond the edge of the ramp, but they were not attached to each other. It's quite possible that a wave lifted the visor over the ramp. There is no denying that ramp damages exist, only that different experts have claimed their formation differently. Moreover, the existence of damages does not automatically mean that they occurred at the initial stage of the accident. It's the same with the bow visor. The fact that the visor fell off does not mean that it came off at the very beginning of the accident. It is possible that the visor bent away when the ship was heeling. In fact, it is even very likely. Each structure is more durable when used as intended and is more vulnerable to unnatural use. The bow visor is built to sail straight, with the bow vertical edge slamming against the waves. Locks and hinges are then struck by more or less of the same force. When the ship is sideways, the waves hit one side of the visor, and this means that the fastenings on one side are significantly under higher pressure. There are experts whose research shows that damages to the ramp and visor indicate that the visor detached when the ship was in a large heel. This means that the detachment of the visor did not cause the heel, but on the contrary, the heel caused the visor attachments to break and the bow visor to detach. In conclusion, the assessments made by the Joint Investigation Commission on the bow visor and ramp damages have been challenged by other experts. I'm not saying that those other experts are smarter than those accompanied by the Joint Investigation Commission. The problem is that experts often disagree. As a former prosecutor, I know this well. Even in the case of the slightest damage to health, a situation might arise where two so-called national experts reach different conclusions. And that is why it is important that the witnesses, in this case, those who escaped the ship, what they are saying. This is important. And that's why it's important to check alternative versions. Another very important matter in which the Joint Investigation Commission has treated the statements of the survivors very freely concerns the beginning of this accident.
algust.
According to the Joint Investigation Commission's final report, the visor broke off at 1:15 a.m. They summed up the testimonies of the witnesses by describing that passengers noticed unusual noises 10 minutes prior to the visor breaking off. However, if you read the testimonies, a completely different picture opens up. I will give some examples. These are now citations from witness testimonies. I was on the first deck in my cabin when I realized that the storm was very strong. I fell from the bed to the floor. At the same time, I heard a hard bang that was so hard that I flew against the wall of the cabin. I cannot say where the bang came from. It felt as if the ship collided with something. The ship started heeling immediately. Next, just before the ship began to heel to one side, I felt a strong thirst that sounded like a bang. Next, about 30 seconds to 1 minute apart, I heard two minor metal blows, and after about 40 to 50 seconds, I heard a very strong bang, which sounded also metallic. I felt like the ship was pushed in from the side like hammer blows against the hull. At about 1 a.m., I woke up at my cabin on the fourth deck to a sound as if the ship had collided with something and ran aground. When I woke up, the ship was heeling so much that I fell from the top bunk to the floor. I was in my cabin when I felt that the ship was plunging in a deep wave. I asked my spouse what time it was, and I got the answer that 1. That's 12 o'clock in Swedish time. The next moment there was a loud noise. All the things in the cabin flew around. The ship heeled to one side. The engines were silent. I slept when I woke up to hearing a strange voice that can't be described. The ship was heeling. It felt like it had ran aground. And so on, and so on. In other words, people are not talking about unusual sounds that they heard 10 minutes prior to the bow visor falling off. That's the official version. But they are talking about up to 3 consecutive strong thirds, shocks, bangs, which were felt at 1 o'clock and after which the ship went to a noticeable heel. The Joint Investigation Commission has thus distorted both the people's perception and the time perceived events. The absolute majority of those who escaped talk about 1 o'clock. However, the Commission decided that the visor detached with a bang and sank at 1:15. This may seem a minor distortion, and one may ask why such a distortion. The reason is simple. It was necessary to shorten the time of the ship being afloat. The Investigation Commission also understood that when the ramp opened at 1 o'clock, the ship could not have had a heel of 20 to 30 degrees at 1:26, as was recorded in the words of Estonia's second officer in the Mayday message. As mentioned earlier, 2,000 tons of water, which is required to create a heel of 40 degrees, would have entered the ship in a matter of minutes in case of a fully opened ramp. In conclusion, the official version is largely a theory, aligned calculations that have little to do with what the escaped survivors remember. The final report is a well-written story that seems plausible when read, but has weak evidence base. And that is also why many people, including myself, cannot agree with the conclusions of the Joint Investigation Commission's final report. For now, that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer your questions.